Now let's get you the latest updates from the Ukraine conflict. As fighting continues in Ukraine, we now bring you all the recent developments in this crisis. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of committing war crimes for bombing the city of Kharkiv. According to the city's mayor, at least 9 civilians have been killed, including 3 children, by Russian rocket attacks on Monday.
Factory. Do you see the car is hit and...
Російські сили сьогодні жорстоко обстріляли Харків з реактивної артилерії. Це однозначно воєнний злочин. Мирне місто, мирні житлові райони, жодного військового об'єкту. Десятки записів очевидців доводять, що це не окремий помилковий залп, а свідоме знищення людей. Росіяни знали, куди стріляють. За цей злочин точно буде трибунал. Міжнародний. Це порушення усіх конвенцій. Ніхто у світі не пробачить вам вбивство мирних українських людей.
Ukraine has also demanded that the West imposes a no-fly zone for Russian missiles, planes and helicopters in response to Russian shelling of the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. These comments come after Zelensky said that he was analyzing the results of Monday's talks between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. No breakthrough came about in this meeting, and officials from both sides have gone back to their capitals for further consultations before a second round of negotiations. President Putin spoke to his French counterpart and levelled his conditions to ending his offensive against Ukraine. The first was the demilitarization and denazification, as he called it, of Ukraine. And the second was Western recognition of the Russian sovereignty over the Crimean Peninsula. Meanwhile, Ukraine has said that the pace of Russian aggression has slowed. Satellite images have shown that the Russian convoy was slowly but steadily making its way towards the capital. The US has warned that it will impose more sanctions on Russia if Moscow continues to escalate its conflict with Ukraine, while noting that Russia so far has shown no signs of backing down. In New York, the 193-member United Nations General Assembly held a meeting on the crisis on Monday ahead of a vote this week to isolate Russia. The draft resolution already has at least 80 co-sponsors, diplomats said on Monday. More than 100 countries are due to speak before the General Assembly votes.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, refrain must stop.
For more perspective, joining us live now from Washington, D.C. is James Schauenlein, a senior director at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm. James, welcome to WION World is One.
Hi, well, thank you.
My first question, Ukraine's President Zelensky has called for a no-fly zone, as we just told our viewers, to stop Russian bombardment. But the White House says that the U.S. is not considering such a move. Why the resistance to interfere militarily, so to speak? And what does the U.S. stand to lose if it intervenes?
Well, I think the one thing that I think is important to note here is one of the setbacks in the early stages of the Russian intervention has been the failure to achieve absolute air superiority. It's a shocking failure, frankly. It surprised the Russians and it surprised many outside experts as well, that the Ukrainian forces have succeeded in largely from a surface-to-air capability in preventing the Russian Air Force from dominating the skies. A no-fly zone has to be enforced through the use of force, through the use of offensive weapons or the ability to potentially use offensive weapons. The U.S. has been very clear for years that while it stands behind its NATO members, and in fact the Biden administration has surged troops into Eastern European NATO countries, it's not going to defend Ukraine's territory. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. The treaty obligation, collective defense obligation does not apply. So the U.S. is not going to be, and NATO is not going to be enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. To do so would effectively be, a direct challenge to Russia. It would involve U.S. military planes flying up against Russian planes, and that's not going to happen. Or that, unless the Russians, I suspect, take steps that none of us want to see.
Right. James, what are your thoughts about the efficacy of sanctions on Russia? Will they work to isolate Russia and deter Vladimir Putin? A second part of this question, will these sanctions hurt the rest of the world?
I think the question of sanctions is always a very difficult one for policymakers. Sanctions tend to have a delayed effect by their very design. Obviously, it takes time for transactions to be canceled, for banks to change rules, for the full mechanisms to block transactions to exist. One of the things we are seeing in this crisis immediately is actually a move to divestment and cut off relations with Russian firms. You saw a number of extremely high-profile Western companies getting out of, for example, Russian energy companies. You've seen banks cutting off transactions. I think it's amazing, for example, the Chelsea Football Club in the UK, where it has had a Russian owner for 20 years, and the Russian owner handed over control to the trustees of Chelsea. These are all steps that I think are immediately felt both by a Russian elite and also on the Russian economy.
Right.
The other element to watch is in terms of the exchange rates and in terms of inflation. When we think about inflation and commodity prices in general, of course, Russia, as we all know, is a major producer of oil and natural gas products. It's also a major producer of agricultural products.
Right.
What it does need is it needs a lot of other inputs. It needs a lot of other machinery parts. It needs a lot of other things that come from the outside world, and disruptions to supplies are costly over time.
How do you see this conflict, rather this war progressing from this point on? Will backing Putin into a corner work as a way to stop Russian aggression? What's Putin's endgame, so to speak?
So I think what's been remarkable about the last 6 days, and it is we are only 6 days into this, what's been remarkable, I think, in the first instance, is that the Russians have appeared surprised by how difficult the early stages of the conflict can be. I say early, and I'll come back to that, but this is still early stages of the conflict. The Ukrainians have done, have done surprisingly well in holding off the initial stages of this advance. In terms of what Putin's endgame is, he continues to make maximalist demands, and
right.
Even though on the battlefield he has committed, frankly, he's committed a lot of force, but he's not committed his full capabilities to this fight. Over time, I suspect, this is going to continue. Russia's going to continue pressing. We should expect the situation on the ground to deteriorate. I think many analysts are talking about, and I think many military observers are talking about, the Russians are very likely to significantly increase violence, including violence that impacts Ukrainian civilians in the coming days. As they overcome obstacles that they've seen. And that's going to create further counter-reaction in the West. That's going to create further difficult decisions for countries who, for example, for India, which has chosen to abstain in the UN General Assembly, in the UN Security Council so far, from criticizing Russia. When the Russians continue to ratchet up violence, the world is going to have to react. And I think ultimately the question many of us have to take into account, many of our countries have to take into account, is whether we want to live in a world where borders can be redrawn just because one side wants to by the use of force.
Absolutely. James, I'm afraid we're running out of time. Thank you so much for summing that up for our viewers at this hour. It's time now to wrap up this broadcast. Thanks for watching WION World is One with me, Priyanka Sharma. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.